Harry, my sponsor, says it's time to start. So we were just debating, should Harry get up and introduce me? And I decided that he didn't have to do that because he's so comfortable there with his laptop. It seemed cruel to make him get up. So instead, I'll introduce Harry. This is Harry. In case you don't know Harry, Harry has been at Google for how long now?
8 months.
8 months. Harry is the model-based testing guy, among other amazing things, and collector of testing-related lyrics up on his website, and is now blushing, I think, just a little bit. So I'm here thanks to Harry. And I'm here to talk about Agile testing, which of course makes me curious about what you guys are up to. So out of curiosity, how many of you are currently working on a project that you would describe as Agile, whatever flavor? Oh wow, one! Were you all just attracted by the title? Is this flexible testing? We're going to do yoga and testing combined? Okay. Seriously, one? Wait a minute. I know you must be on an XP project, because I know you. This is Mark.
No, I tried.
Oh. How many of you are trying but not there yet on Agile? Oh, okay. Okay. Not okay, and we may have some disagreement about how hard we're really trying on that. All right. Well, I confess I'm surprised because I do know a few people at Google, and everybody I know at Google is an XPer, extreme programming. So how many of you have ever heard of extreme programming? Oh, good, we're getting better. A few of you still haven't, so that's okay. I'll explain a little bit about what extreme programming is, and I need to explain a little bit about how I came to be giving this talk. At this point, I have given a version of this talk several times, and it keeps evolving as my beliefs and understanding and perspectives on Agile testing are evolving. I first started hearing about this Agile stuff several years ago, and initially I was extremely skeptical. It sounded like yet another buzzword. Yet another flavor of the month fad that was gonna go away. Anybody remember computer-aided software engineering? That had a real long life, right? So I figured I could ignore this safely. But then I started reading, and I became intrigued. Because it seemed like these Agile people had answers for stuff that we've been struggling with in software for a really long time. Oh, I better find out more. So then I attended a talk by Kent Beck. He's the guy who wrote Extreme Programming Explained, Embrace Change, like the big industry-changing book that was published in, I believe, 1999. Well, in 2001, I heard him speak at Quality Week. And he basically said that QA people are a throwback to Tayloristic, scientific, time and motion management kinds of things, and that we're all irrelevant in the brave new world of extreme programming. Now, I have to admire his courage, because he said this to a standing room only audience of quality professionals. He survived the experience. I have seen him since. Now, it was actually kind of funny, because about 45 minutes in, he was done with his prepared talk, and he looked at his watch and he said, well, I'm done with my prepared talk, and I guess we're done because my time is up. And his track chair, the guy who's responsible for managing the time and the talks, stood up and said, well, actually, we scheduled you for a double track session, so you've got 45 more minutes to answer questions. Yeah. Yes, he did. Well, as somebody who I am, in fact, test obsessed. There are a few bracelets left for those of you who might not have gotten yours. They're all in the front row. This was, in fact, an enticement to get people to sit in the front row. I am, in fact, test obsessed. I'm not just test infected. I live, eat, breathe, and sleep testing. I think it's fun. And I know that that makes me just a little bit odd. It is difficult to explain to people who don't understand, why anybody would think that software testing is fun, how I can find it so exciting. So as a test-obsessed person, I was surprised to hear somebody who I thought was test-infected say that testers were irrelevant. So I figured I got to go find out for myself what life is like for a tester on an XP project. And I got lucky enough to get a contract on an XP project where I was a designated tester working with the development team on this XP project. And I had a blast. Have you ever gotten software? Well, first of all, how many of you would identify yourselves as testers of some flavor or another? Okay, so those of you who are testers of some flavor or another, have you ever gotten software delivered to you to test and it wouldn't launch at all? This has happened, right? Didn't happen once on this extreme programming project, not once. Not only did I never get a DOA build, I didn't even have to wait for them to give me a build because it was safe to check out whatever was the latest thing checked into source control, and it would work. Wow, that was a new experience for me. I was used to projects where it could take weeks to integrate the software to get it to work at all, much less basically do what it's supposed to do. Yeah, there was stuff to find, though. It wasn't perfect. Reports of the demise of QA people were wildly optimistic. They needed me. I felt loved and appreciated. Now that's a weird feeling for a tester. Yeah! How odd to feel loved and appreciated to do what I love to do. I was hooked. Never again was I going to go back to a traditional project. So since that time, that was about 18 months ago, I've been working with extreme programming teams. Now, one of the reasons why my beliefs and feelings and thinking about testing on extreme programming projects are morphing, evolving, is because my role is starting to morph and evolve. The project that I'm on right now, I've crossed over to what some might say is the dark side. I'm a programmer on this project. I'm just another programmer with the development team. And let's face it, I'm probably the most junior programmer on this development team, but I'm the most senior tester. And what that means is that I have a perspective on this project that none of the other developers do. I'm the one who's most likely to say, I think we ought to write a test for this before we move forward. We're doing test-driven development. How many of you have heard of test-driven development? Okay, and y'all know that it's not a testing methodology, it's a design methodology, right? So I'm the one who's most likely to have the little tester paranoia kick in and say, I think we ought to write a test to drive this little tiny subtle aspect of this functionality. And I'm the one who's going to say, yes, we can too test that. Let's just figure out how. Right? So I have a different perspective on that project, and that's starting to shift my perspective about how testers can effectively collaborate with Agile developers on Agile projects. But in the meantime, here we've got this talk that I'm going to give about Agile testing that represents what I think today and what I think tomorrow might change. If you would like to get the slides, I didn't want to burn a bunch of paper to give to you. You can find them online on my site at qualitytree.com, agiletesting-3.1.pdf. So they're there. And we have to talk about traditional testing before we can dig too deep into Agile testing. So let's take a look at traditional testing. With great optimism, the project manager releases the project plan. There's a big dun-dun-dun meeting, the kickoff meeting. 7 full color printouts of the Gantt chart are distributed to every executive, and it looks like this, roughly. We're going to spend an analysis phase. First, we're going to have an analysis phase. We're going to spend time analyzing the problem because we know that if we don't think about it very hard, we know we can't get it right the first time. We've all been in this meeting, right? Where we're having this discussion. So we're going to analyze it, and then we're going to spend time designing. And about 6 months from now, we think we might understand enough about the problem to begin coding. So then we're going to do a whole lot of coding, and then we're going to go into the testing, the bug fix phase, stabilize everything, and then we're going to release. This sounds familiar? This never happens. If we lived in a perfect world, this might happen. We don't live in a perfect world. Instead, inevitably, this happens. We spend a whole lot of time analyzing and designing and coding our hearts out, and then all of a sudden, at the very end, they hand it off to somebody in an independent test group and say, test. Make sure that it's quality. It's your responsibility to assure the quality. And then we've got like 3 days to test, and then we're going to release. That looks kind of familiar, right? Okay, now there's a whole body of knowledge about how to do testing in this environment that has been developed over the last roughly 3 decades, maybe more. And these practices have worked in this context, and I honor these practices. We've done things like become the last defender of quality. Test departments stand there and say, it must get by me before you can release it to the poor hapless users. I protect the user. Does that stance sound kind of familiar? Right? So we're the last defender of quality. We want to employ strict change management. You can't check in that bug fix unless I okay it. Right? So we're going to be very strict. We're trying to control the chaos. We're going to make sure that we've done our homework. We've got detailed preparation, planning, test design. Excuse me. We're going to do a whole ton of documentation because when it comes to that end of that release, we know that we're going to have to bring in outside contractors who don't have a clue about what we've been doing for the last 8 months, and they're going to have to get up to speed very quickly, so they have to have very detailed test scripts. Sound familiar? Right? We have to do these things. Strict entrance and exit criteria. It can't come into test until it passes the minimum acceptance tests. We will not accept it. It's not in the test phase until it has passed our gate. Heavyweight test automation, starting with commercial tools that do lots of record and playback kind of things. We attempt to enforce the process in some cases. That's where the whole QA title comes in, because QA is more than testing, right? QA involves quality of the process as well. So we attempt to enforce the process. There's only one problem with this. It works in a traditional context. It helps control the chaos. It's anti-agile. This is why the Agilists hate us, because we're trying to enforce process. We're trying to do strict change management, but Agile is about embracing change. So if we are accustomed to a traditional test environment, how do we adjust our practices to contribute effectively in an Agile context? Well, for starters, the Agile context is very different from a traditional context. Instead of releasing a big bang thing at the very end, we're releasing all throughout. Each of these is a completed, releasable feature, or set of features as we go through. We've got short iterations, lots of deliverables, and in fact, that's what Agile means, delivering a continuous stream of business value. The implication of that for us testers is that we have to deliver a continuous stream of information. We don't have the opportunity to prepare for 6 months before we start working on stuff. We have to be ready to start testing day 1 of the project. Fortunately, the code is ready for us to test as well. It may be baby code. It doesn't do much, but what it does, and we can test that. Of course, there is a warning here. Just because some manager somewhere, and you know who you are, says, we're going Agile, dun 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 dun, therefore, I want you to revise all of your test estimates to account for the fact that we're going Agile. Well, that's not enough to call it Agile, right? Just because we dump the documentation, compress the schedule, and code up to the last minute does not mean that we are releasing a continuous stream of value. So we have to be careful about adopting Agile practices and make sure that it really does fit the context. Typically, organizations achieve agility by adopting one or more of the Agile methods that are out there. And here are just 4 examples. The most well-known is typically extreme programming followed by Scrum. Extreme programming is a set of very well-defined practices, and I happen to know that Mark is an expert on XP. You can raise your hand. This is Mark, everybody, and he's a Googler. You have other experts on XP amongst you. I'm not an expert on XP. I'm merely a practitioner of XP. The thing that has continued to amaze me is the misunderstandings in the industry in general about what extreme programming is. There's this myth that it's the license to hack for cowboys. Anybody heard this? Extreme programming must be this loosey-goosey kind of thing. It's actually the most disciplined development methodology I have ever worked with. Developers write automated unit tests before they write a line of code. So they've got a full suite of 100% automated unit tests that get run before they check in anything. Continuous integration ensures that everything not only compiles all together, but actually functions. They automate their acceptance tests, and they take responsibility for working with the customer to automate acceptance tests. So as a result, the unit tests become executable specifications of what the code should do, and the automated acceptance tests become executable requirements. That's pretty disciplined, right? Now, they don't happen to love documentation a whole lot, and that's because documentation, it's overhead. If stuff doesn't get to the end user, if it never achieves, if it's never intended for a customer, if it's a byproduct of the process rather than the thing that you sell or deliver, then in lean terms, it's waste. Nobody likes waste, right? Now, some waste is necessary. It's not possible to produce software with zero documentation. Well, I take that back. I've seen groups try. It doesn't work real well. You have to have some, but the question is, how do we minimize that so that we've got the maximum value for the minimum cost? And that's what Agile teams typically look to do. Scrum, now where XP is really developer-centric, it's got some stuff about how you manage projects, but its real strength is in providing a set of practices that a development team can use to produce good software. Scrum is a project management-focused set of practices that focuses around big visible charts. How do you demonstrate progress? How do you show your customer that you're on track? So each of the different Agile methodologies has its own strengths. It's got the audience that it speaks to, and a lot of organizations have found that they've gotten a lot of value out of wrapping extreme programming with Scrum so that they get both the project management side and the development side. Other methodologies include Mary Poppendick's stuff on lean. She's written a whole ton about how you apply the principles of lean manufacturing to software development, and what she wrote actually makes sense. See, before I read her book, if you'd said you can apply lean manufacturing to software development, I would have said, no, you can't. It's different. Software is different. Well, she figured out how to do it because she's got such a rich background in both software development and in lean manufacturing. Crystal is Alistair Coburn's slightly less rigid model for doing Agile software development, very developer-centric. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's been written about how to do Agile and how to do it well. Now, when us testers are working with Agile teams, though, instead of being that last defender of quality, instead of having this stance, we have to shift our stance. Now we focus on supporting the team, typically from the perspective of either supporting the developers in the developer-facing side of things, moving the project forward, or in supporting the customers in figuring out whether the software was acceptable. Because ultimately, we're working for one of those two groups of people. And this is one of the areas where traditionalists don't really like the way that XP kind of oversimplifies the world and says, look, there's developers and there are the customers who are the customers for whatever the developers produce. These aren't necessarily the end user customers. Customer in the XP sense of the word has a special meaning. It's capital C, customer. And that person or set of people, they speak with one voice to say, this is what the software should do. And then they get to say, and I agree that you've done it. Thank you very much. Good job. So as testers, we may be supporting the developers in moving the project forward. We may be supporting the customers in figuring out whether they got what they were trying to pay for. We want to focus on shifting our practices with two key ideas in mind. One is, let's increase the feedback speed, the speed of the feedback loop. And two is reducing waste. Let's reduce the number of byproducts that we have to create in order to get the information that our stakeholders want. And we want to focus on testing provides information so that we can reduce risk. Because that's ultimately what we do, right? No matter how we do it. So let's compare and contrast traditional versus Agile. The traditional attitude towards change is we've got to manage it and control it. The Agile attitude is, hey, change happens. We might as well be ready for it. The traditional attitude towards planning, we'd better do comprehensive upfront test design, because if we don't do it at the beginning, we're just going to get absolutely bulldozed at the end. Whereas the Agile approach is, yeah, we got a plan. We got to plan a little, but we're going to plan as we go. Documentation tends to be verbose. It serves a couple of purposes. One is communication, and two is cover your assets on a traditional project. We want to make sure that we can't possibly be blamed when things go wrong. On Agile, we want to do as much as necessary, but no more. Handoffs, well, we've got formal entrance and exit criteria on traditional projects. On Agile projects, it's not a relay race. We're going to collaborate because we're all one team. Test automation on traditional projects tends to be very tool-centric, focused on the commercial tools, and it tends to be built by specialists. There'll be a separate test automation department. By contrast, on Agile projects, everybody is testing, and the developers are continually automating their tests. We can leverage that. So let's look at these in just a wee bit more detail. To embrace change, we have to be able to minimize duplication and plan for maintenance, right? So at one point, I was working with one of my clients to help them assess various testing tools. And we were meeting with all of the major vendors and getting them to comment on our project. Now, our project was a somewhat special context. It was not an extreme programming project, but it was a very early stage project. This was a product that was expected to be released in about 3 to 4 years in a medical device company. Now, the stuff that we were working on early on, we wanted to do automated tests that were end-to-end tests of the whole system. And the system included stuff that a clinician would use that connected to embedded stuff that was the guts of the thing, and then that connected to proprietary hardware that ultimately controlled treatment to a patient. So there's a whole lot of moving parts in this thing. And we wanted to make sure at the earliest stages possible that all the stuff was working well together and that you could have a whole lot of cycles through. Makes sense. A good thing to test early on, right? The way we were going to drive this was all the way from the UI down to the hardware and then back to the UI. We felt that that was a good way to find this information out. So one of the questions that we had for every vendor that we talked to was, talk to us about maintenance. Because we know that this user interface that's here right now, it's just a quickly tossed up mock-up, and we know it's going to be changing over the course of the next 3 years. So what's it going to look like to help us figure out what it's going to look like to maintain tests in your environment? One of the vendors had the gall to say to us, oh, well, you should nail down the user interface first. Can you imagine a 3-year project, and they want us to nail down what the user interface looks like first? Now, the user interface is important because it's the thing that the clinician is going to use, but don't you think it's a little bit more important to nail down how that hardware is going to behave and how that controller software is going to behave? And, you know, maybe the UI should wait until closer to the end and we'll have a professional UI designer figure out what the UI should look like. But they wanted us to nail down the UI first and didn't think it was worth us using their tool to automate unless we were going to do that. We said, thanks for playing. We're done. And we went with another vendor where we were able to more easily modify our tests as we went along because they had better support for maintainability. So as you are working through the process of adopting strategies for testing, you got to bear in mind that change is going to happen. It's going to happen every month. How can we make sure that whatever it is that we're using is going to support that change? Speaking of change, we want to plan ahead, but not too far ahead, because anytime we plan farther ahead than the project is ready to go, we risk wasting our time. Because we're going to plan all this stuff, and then we're never going to have those stories be implemented. So on an Agile project, we don't want to plan any further ahead than the next iteration because we don't know what's going to be implemented after that. Right? Stuff that was on the list today might come off the list tomorrow. This is one of the reasons I tend to use very informal mechanisms to do planning and communication. I prefer using whiteboards, sticky notes, wikis. Is this the kind of stuff you guys use? Yeah, largely? Okay. As opposed to databases or big Microsoft, sorry, I said the M word, charts and stuff? Yeah, okay. Because the more informal it is, the easier it is to change when the universe changes around us. When I do my test documentation, I want to keep it simple and capture the essence. There are folks out there who say that the best practice is to detail every single step. Well, if you do that and you've got thousands upon thousands of test cases, you end up producing thousands upon thousands of pages of documentation for any given project. Documentation that no customer ever sees the value of. In the worst case, I once went into one organization where it was the worst case I'd ever seen of over-documenting because nobody was using the documentation. I mean nobody, not the testers, not the people who wrote it. They had a whole separate team set up for designing the tests, and those people were tasked with documenting test cases. These people spent 90% of their time in Mercury Test Director documenting tests. They would then sign the sign-off form to send those tests over to an entire group of people whose job was to execute the test cases. I had the opportunity to talk at length with the people who were charged with executing the test cases. I said, how's this process working? They kind of did the look around. You know the look around, to make sure nobody's listening in, and closed the door, and they said, we don't use them. The people who are tasked with designing those test cases haven't actually run the software in 3 years. They don't know what it does anymore. This is an organization that was spending millions every year on documentation that no one ever read. That's waste. So I prefer, first of all, I prefer it when my work gets used. It's just, you know, it's a quirk of mine. I like the stuff that I produce to have value. So I want to make it as lightweight as possible. I want to reuse as much of it as possible. If I come up with a checklist, I'm going to reuse that checklist in as many places as I possibly can. And you all know that I don't mean copy and paste it everywhere, right? I mean, that's a whole other sin in test documentation. Have you ever seen an organization, I know you guys don't do this, so I'm not afraid of stepping on, you know, putting my foot in my mouth. Have you ever seen a test organization that takes the requirement specification, you know, that big formal document that says the system shall blah, 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 the system will blah, 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 blah. They copy that into a new document, and then they run a macro to do a global search and replace on the system shall to make it say the system, verify that the system does? This is a sin. We now have an unmaintainable document that nobody knows what it means, right? Okay, so I don't ever want to do that. I don't want to copy and paste. I want to centralize. You guys are the knowledge repository of the internet. You know about centralizing and distributing as well, by the way, but, you know, centralize that knowledge. Okay. Here is one example of lightweight test documentation that is sanitized, but essentially from a real project. Here we've got a test number. That part's optional, but you know, if you want to be able to say test number for blah, blah, blah. Test number, a category, a test name. That was all the detail that I had for those tests. I didn't bother with any detailed steps. There is a cost to this. Very few people would have been able to run these tests unless they'd already been on the project. But it was enough information for us. The date last executed. Notice all of a sudden this document is now serving two purposes. Ooh, I love leverage. This is good that we can make one document serve two purposes. The two purposes are test design and test results tracking. Last executed, the result, and the configuration on which it was run. So this is one example of very, very lightweight documentation. Another example is a mind map. This is built in a program called Mind Manager. There's a bunch of mind mapping software out there. Pick your favorite flavor. The reason I like Mind Manager is that if you happen to be working on a hybrid project where on the one side you've got the Agilists and on the other side you've got the traditionalists, and the traditionalists keep banging on the Agilists for more documentation, this is great, because Mind Manager will spit out the most formal-looking Word documents you've ever seen. You give it a template, it takes something that looks kind of free-form like this and turns it into something that's good for military use. Very handy. So you can work in this, and it can spit out the formal stuff for you. So this is another example of lightweight styles. All right, the next thing we want to do is reduce those handoffs. This is not a relay race. We're all one big team. That's one of the basic Agile concepts. We're a team. We're not a series of independent departments. We're all responsible for the outcome. One of the biggest lessons I had to learn on XP projects is that it's way too easy, if there is a designated tester on an XP project, to kind of almost do the traditional thing. It's sort of scary how easy it is for this to happen and say, oh, that's a test thing. Elisabeth's going to do that. I don't have to think about it. And the next thing you know, even though this is an XP team and we're all test infected, I'm sitting over here hopelessly behind in my testing tasks because none of the stuff I'm doing is being tracked with the rest of the project. So we have to guard against this, even with XP teams, even with Agile teams, and make sure that the testing tasks are considered at the same weight of priority as any other kind of infrastructure development task. Co-locating testers and programmers is an excellent idea. It does not by itself guarantee communication. There's this bizarre social thing that happens. On 2 projects now, I've been in a bullpen environment. Now, this is typical of Agile projects, that you'll have this big room that's kind of like a war room or the bullpen, and everybody's all seated in there. And on 2 projects, I was in the bullpen. I was with everybody else, except I had this table that was kind of off to the side. I mean, we're talking kinda, like no more than 3 feet off to the side. And entire days would go by without anybody from development ever talking to me. Now, and it's this bizarre social dynamic. It's too easy to become isolated, so I became aggressive about sitting outside my designated area in the rest of the bullpen. And this is what, as Agile testers, we end up having to do, just to remind people that we're here and we're here to help. And really, they saw me as there to help. They didn't see me as an impediment to progress. In fact, I went on one of the teams, I had a couple of weeks where I was out of town, and then I came back. And the day that I came back, one of the developers heard the door close, very small office, and so everybody heard everything, heard the door closed, did the prairie dog thing of popping his head up above the cubicles, saw me, and said, Elisabeth is back, Elisabeth is back. So, I mean, I was loved and appreciated and felt all warm and fuzzy and part of the team, and yet I still had to make sure that I reminded the team that I was there. Have you ever been in the meeting where somebody says, okay, now everybody get out your razor blades because we're going to sign in blood on this one? Yeah, some of you have heard this. One of you back there has apparently been on healthy projects your entire career because you're back there going, no, never seen that. Either that or you've got a very sarcastic sense of humor. I've been in that meeting too many times, and it's painful, frankly. Because, I mean, I understand the intent. The intent is to say, really, are we really sure we're ready to go? I understand the intent. But there's a flip side to that intent, isn't there? Because I'm going to hold you to it. Because somebody is going to come after me because my signature is on the QA manager line. And if there is a failure in the field, I know that it will be my fault because my signature is on that line. Well, this is just a ritual with a purpose and a dark side. So let's take the purpose and find other ways to achieve the purpose without all of that blame stuff that gets in the way. So the purpose is to get agreement that we are actually done. This is a conversation between the people who produced the software and the people who are supposed to accept it. The people who produce the software are saying, we're done. We can't think of anything else that we're supposed to do in order to meet the criteria that we think that you have given us. We're done. We've met the criteria. We've hit the bar. On we go. And the other side is supposed to say either, yeah, looks good. Okay, I accept it. I agree with you. You're done with this. It's time to move on. Or they say, no, this does not meet what we thought we asked you to do. It's a very simple conversation that results in either an accept or a reject. Well, so let's make it a simple conversation that results in an accept or a reject. One of the things that you can do to do that is have a ritual of exploratory testing all together as a team, a whole team, with the customers there and the developers there and everybody else who is involved and is interested there at the end of every iteration to go through the features and see if you get agreement about whether or not the features are ready to be accepted. Right? It's a lovely ritual, and it's one that makes people feel all warm and fuzzy because they get to see stuff working. And by the way, if your iterations are a month or less in length, which they should be, you get to have that warm, fuzzy feeling on a regular basis. How cool is that? You could also have, I've seen it be very successful to have the primary customer in the XP sense of that special capital C word do a demo once a week for all of the interested parties on the business stakeholder side of things, with the engineers all in the room, so everybody's one big happy family gathering around the table all together, and there's a demo and there's a projector and cool stuff is happening. And they get to get that feedback, and most of the feedback is usually positive, because after all, these Agile teams are employing good development practices, so you don't have embarrassing demos where the thing blue screens in the middle of the demo. It basically works, and there are some nitpicks. And you get that feedback, and you get it live. How cool is that? So instead of signing in blood, let's find other rituals that accomplish the same goal of having the conversation, do you accept it? Yes, I accept it. Or no, I don't. Without all of the blame stuff thrown in. Now, test automation on Agile projects is really interesting because they start automating before they even start coding. Coming from a traditional background, this was a shock to me. But I now practice test-driven development. I love test-driven development. I think it's the coolest thing since forever. I don't know. Anyway, typically what you'll find is that developers on XP projects anyway, not all Agile, but XP projects are using some flavor of X unit, whether it's JUnit, JS unit, JWeb unit. Pick your favorite unit depending on the technology that you're working with. They're already doing automated tests in that technology in the language that they're already writing the code in. Typically, Agile projects will then employ something like fitness, domain-specific languages, some kind of acceptance level, system level test automation. And this requires a collaboration between the people who understand the system from a business standpoint, who can specify what the test cases should be in terms of business rules or in terms of behavior that they expect to see, and then the people who are able to write the fixtures that will support the automation to make that happen. So typically that's what you see on Agile XP projects. And this means that we as testers have the opportunity to collaborate with the developers to write the test automation. We don't have to put up with web pages that don't have IDs for anything. And we're trying to figure out, okay, I can get an array of all the input fields, and then I can iterate down to the, you don't have to do that anymore because the developers already had to put in all the testability hooks to make their unit tests work. How cool? Yes. Okay. You guys aren't as excited as I would expect about that. Maybe that's because you just never had to deal with completely untestable code. Has anybody ever had untestable code? Okay, well those, 5 of you who have experienced untestable code, you should be like excited about the prospect of the testability hooks already being built in. Okay. The other thing that we can do is use that test automation to help support early exploratory testing. So common wisdom has it that you can't start testing until there is an externally available interface against which to test, which means that if you're doing a GUI-based thing, you can't actually start testing until there's a GUI, right? Nah, yes you can. Now, you can do manual, and I mean manual testing. You can do manual testing against something that's completely not ready for external interface or for external interaction, by using automation to help drive the app to a particular point, dink with it manually through whatever interfaces you've got available to you in whatever creative, and let's face it, we're all testers. Well, yes, actually, we are all testers. No matter what your title is, you are a tester. We're all testers, and we all occasionally have that moment of inspiration when we think, heh, 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 heh. I'll bet if I do this, it will break. You can do that before the code is, from a traditional standpoint, ready, but only because there's already automation built up that you can leverage to get the app to the point where you can do that thing, right? And then you've got other automation in place to help reset the app to another state so that you can do more malicious, horrible, evil, terrible things. By the way, I didn't mention, I did tell you all that I am test obsessed. What I didn't tell you is that I am in fact an evil person, or at least so I've been told. Just never to people, always to software. All right, so this is my current view of Agile testing, that there are 3 basic activities that are happening, and all of these are happening within the iteration for the features that are being implemented now, whatever now means for you. One is automated acceptance or story test. Now you may be wondering, why is that all the way on the left as though it's the first thing that's happening? Because in some organizations it actually is. As weird as that may sound, Some organizations do story-driven development, which means they define the acceptance criteria in terms of stories, in terms of story tests, so that they can run the story test, watch it fail. So you watch this thing fail, you know that the story isn't implemented yet, then you create a unit test, an automated unit test, that would implement some little itty-bitty tiny sliver of that story. And you watch it fail, because if it passes, you know the test is bad. If the test passes when there was nothing written whatsoever that should make it pass, it's probably not a good test. Just like if the test automation passes when the software under test is not installed, that's a bad sign. Okay. So now you're doing the automated unit tests, and typically that's the developers. I've had some people say, well, we're doing Agile stuff because we're doing automated unit tests, but it's the testers who are doing the automated unit tests and the developers are developing the code. I will submit to you that well, better than no automated unit tests probably isn't the most Agile approach that they could be taking. So the developers are automating unit tests. And then we're augmenting that with manual exploratory testing, not manual scripted testing. See, if we know enough to script it manually so that we can hand it to anybody who knows how to operate a computer, I will suggest to you that's a test that should be automated. If it's that clear cut, which leaves us free to do the exciting stuff that we haven't thought about yet until we put our hands on the keyboard and the malicious side of our mind takes over, and we think of the evil things we could do to this software. Okay. So that brings us to the end of that. That's my current thinking on this. That is shared, by the way, amongst various people who are part of the Agile community. There is a huge Agile community. Now, maybe y'all are shy and you just all have been very involved in the Agile community, but just in case, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, there's a huge community out there. There is an XP mailing list. There is a test-driven development mailing list. There is an Agile, well, now one Agile conference in the US, other Agile conferences throughout the world. If this is an interesting thing to you, you have internal resources, places that you can go internally to find out about the great broader world of people who believe that this is a better way to develop software than that slide I showed you at the beginning with the testing all compressed at the very end. Okay. Further reading, some books, and this list is in the slides, which again are on my site. Some thank yous to some folks who reviewed early versions of this work, and then once again you can find the slides on my site at that location. So, how far over my time slot did I go? We have time for questions. How marvelous. Any questions? Harry!
So what kind of bugs make it past the unit tests and exploratory early process? What are you seeing in the field?
Two kinds make it past, or it kind of falls into two big categories. One is end-to-end or sequence-related. Okay, three big categories. See, I'm going to change my mind even as I'm answering the question. All right, I'll stick with three categories. End-to-end tests. So things that involve multiple moving parts in the system that you aren't likely to be able to catch with a single unit test because it involves dependencies between multiple parts of the thing. So like integration tests or system-level end-to-end tests. Sequence tests. You go through it once this way, you go through it again this other way, and doing it the first time sets something in some weird state that results in it failing the second time through. So that's a sequence-oriented test. The thing you're tweaking is sequence. And then the third thing is data-related, where we didn't anticipate that the database could have nulls, for example, because we thought that we were going to put a not null allowed on that column, but we're dealing with legacy data, and it turns out that historically the nulls were allowed. So those are kind of the three big categories of stuff. So. Yes? Because there's stuff that's much easier to catch with a unit test than with end-to-end tests. So if there is a method way buried down here, it lives down here in its little world, and it takes input from other stuff. And every now and again, other stuff will throw it a null. And then it will barf, because it doesn't know how to handle nulls. But from the user interface, which is about 17 layers of abstraction away from that one little method way down here, all of that user interface, it's really hard to get that null down to that one little point down here from all the way up here. So what we find is that each of the different layers of testing represent different questions that we want to answer about the software. The unit tests answer the question, does it do what I, as the developer, expected it to do? And has it changed? So see, that's the other thing. The automated unit tests become change detectors. So let me give you an example of a bug that was caught by automated unit tests. It was testing regular expression stuff. You ever done regular expression stuff? It's like gnarly to get that stuff just right. And so we had a series of tests that tested, pass in these strings, make sure that we get this response back from this method that's doing regular expression transformations. We had to make a change to implement a new feature. We made that change, and all of a sudden 3 of our automated unit tests broke because we broke that regular expression. So that was a change detector for us. If we hadn't had the automated unit tests, we probably wouldn't have caught that until it became a surprise in the field. Yes?
You said that agile teams would usually work in a bullpen kind of area.
Yeah.
What about global teams?
Okay, so the question was, if agile teams typically work in a bullpen kind of area, what about global teams? I confess this is one of those areas where it is very difficult to have that same level of camaraderie, but some organizations have had success. One of the ways that they get success is by doing a whole lot of FaceTime so that they build up the camaraderie and the trust. Now, if you look at the open source community, although not all open source projects practice Agile, you will find that there's a fair amount of camaraderie and trust within open source projects, and yet they're completely distributed. So somehow they achieved that. The key goal, I think, is that camaraderie and trust, and you have to achieve that. One way of achieving it is by having everybody in the same room, but there are other ways of achieving it. Sorry, it's a very general answer, but video conferencing helps.
Who has a bigger problem going Agile, testers or developers? How do you get buy-in from both groups?
Who has the biggest problem going Agile, testers or developers? Yes. It depends. It depends on your organization. So actually, my husband works for a company now. He's a product manager. So he's on the marketing side of things, and he's trying to push for Agile. So where the push comes for Agile depends on your organization. And by the way, both the testers and the developers are resisting him in this case, as well as the managers, because they don't see it yet. They don't quite get the benefit to them yet. Whereas he sees it very clearly from a business standpoint. So I think that you just have to take each individually and find out what their concerns are. In some cases, like let's take XP. If you go into an organization and want to do XP, in some cases the developers are very comfy in their corner offices. They've worked really hard to get a door. And all of a sudden you're saying that you're going to relocate them into a bullpen environment and they're going to have to pair. That means that they're going to have somebody looking over their shoulder every minute that they're coding. Well, for some developers, that's a really scary thing. Now, I can tell you, as a developer who's in the middle of a project right now where I'm pairing, it's also the best professional experience that I've had because we're producing as a team good code. And it feels good to write good stuff. So, anyway. Yes?
I'm a unit testing advocate, and I find that there are people who write unit tests and people who don't write unit tests. And I think we understand how to try and help the people that don't write unit tests write unit tests. But what I'm finding is there's another difference, that there of the people that write unit tests, there are people who write good unit tests and people who write bad unit tests. And bad unit tests, to me, are unit tests that have dependency trees that are practically forests by themselves. And as a result, break all the time. And so these people say, well, I tried writing unit tests, and it's not helpful to me because they break all the time for no good reason, because the test is broken on the code. How do you help fight that?
Okay, so there's a principle that somebody smarter than me put forth that I don't remember who it was, but on the XP mailing list, I remember seeing this principle: if it hurts, do more of it. Now that sounds counterintuitive, right? Because if it hurts, we want to do less of it because we don't want the pain. But if you do more of it, the fact is that you have to find ways out of self-preservation. You have to find ways to reduce the pain, unless you just become numb from hitting your head against the wall. But most people, I find, have enough self-interest that they're not just going to go numb. They're going to find ways to address the pain. So where you've got these tests that are incredibly fragile, And I'm guilty of writing fragile tests too. In fact, anybody who's ever done system level tests quickly discovers that it's much easier to write fragile tests than to write robust tests, right? Run them more often, and every time they break, fix them. Don't let them languish in the unfixed state. The test should always be green. The test that you believe should pass should always be green. And commenting out doesn't count. No fair putting the X in front of the test keyword, right? So just the act of fixing them more often is going to yield, even if it's only in one person's head, but hopefully it's a shared team knowledge base of what tends to make tests fragile for our context, at which point you start to learn what not to do, because it's going to make things fragile, and can start applying mocks better and using various techniques to break the dependencies so that you do end up with tests where when they fail, your first reaction isn't, oh, the test broke, as opposed to, oh, the code broke. Hey!
Hey! So, in this vision you're laying out, do you imagine that someday the distinction between testers and developers actually goes away?
So does the distinction between testers and developers go away? Maybe. I realize that's heresy. Okay, so let's go back to the 1980s when the big QA consultants, I was not one of them, it's not my fault, don't blame me, but they were all going around, the quality consultants, saying tests should be independent. Y'all remember that mantra? Tests should be independent, tests must report up to a vice president who is completely independent from the vice president of development, because if you don't do that, you're being irresponsible and you must not be quality aware. You've all heard that spiel, right? I bought into it for a long time. I don't buy into it anymore. And the reason is because test is never independent, no matter who they report to. Test reveals information. Test yields information. If there is no audience for that information, they don't need us, right? So it doesn't matter that we're there. So presumably there's an audience for that information. Now, if the audience for that information is development, then I don't care who my boss's 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 boss is. I work with development. And if the audience for that information is a product manager, I don't care who my boss's 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 boss is. I'm an agent for product management. Right? So does the distinction between developer and tester go away? Maybe, and maybe that's not such a bad thing for the developer-centric testers. I tend to be one of those because I'm a tester who codes, and I confess I'm a geek. Now, there are also testers who specialize in understanding the domain. They support the customers. They come up with good test cases. Typically, this is one of the hardest problems with XP, is having the customers write good acceptance tests. Right, John? I'm picking out John. Hi, John. Because 2 years ago, I think it was, you invited me to speak at Bay XP on how can we get customers to write acceptance tests. So this has been a point of pain for XP teams for a long time. And the answer is get somebody who knows something about testing to help the customer, not be the substitute for the customer. And that's the key thing. We don't become a substitute. We testers don't become a substitute for anybody. We support the development effort, and or we support the customer side of things, specifying and accepting the code. So yeah, I think I'm starting to think, and this is heresy, but I'm starting to think that testing is a skill set, and some people love testing, like me. I love testing. And yet I'm finding that the lines are blurring a little bit, and it's becoming just another big skill set out of what I offer a team. So, yeah.
So, if I understand correctly, the responsibility seems to blur a little bit between the developer and the tester, right? So who will be the person eventually responsible for the quality of the product?
Ah, if the responsibility is blurring between the tester and the developer, who's ultimately responsible? Some of you know what I'm going to say, right? Let's say it in unison. The team. See, this is one of the biggest mind shifts for Agile, and one of the biggest areas that's difficult for management to accept. Because management typically wants to know, who do I blame? At the end of the day, who do I come back to if it breaks? The buck stops here, where is here? Because I want to know whose desk that's on so that I can blame them. Right?
So follow-up question, how do we make sure developer has a good quality of unit tests, sufficient coverage?
Okay, so how do we make sure that the quality of the test was sufficiently good? Well, that's a slightly more complex answer. You can use code coverage analysis tools to figure out what coverage you're getting. There is no one person who is responsible for the quality of the unit tests. The responsibility belongs to the, all together in unison, the team. And this is one of the reasons why extreme programming teams believe in shared code ownership. So it's not like this is my section of the code and that is your section of the code. We all work on the code, and the code starts to look like any one of us could have written it. Yeah?
Yeah, I have a couple of kind of objections to what you just said. First of all, the team.
This does not surprise me that somebody would object to the heresy that I have just committed.
Well,
Yes?
the team first. I think putting the responsibility on the team sounds very good, but in the end, you're basically putting the responsibility on no one. I think it's very easy to get away and say, well, it's because of the team, it's not just me. I think it's important to name one person. Another thing is that you say the tests need to stay green all the time. Never let tests go red.
That was supposed to be green.
Well, okay. But in practice, I'm sure a lot of people nodded when you said that, but in practice it happens, right? You know that a test is green in the morning, it's red in the morning, it needs to be fixed, and you just don't have time because you have other red tests that you need to fix first. You know these two tests are going to stay red for a couple of weeks. It can happen, but it's the reality, right? It's the difference in theory and practice. So I think the solution is not really to say it has to stay green because there's only so much you can do, but more what can the testing framework do to help you keep track of those tests, make sure that they don't slip, that we don't ship with red tests.
Okay, so am I allowed to invoke the M word again, Microsoft? They shipped with a product that, according to the popular press, and we all know how messed up the popular press gets reality, but according to the popular press, they shipped with 63,000 bugs, and they were vilified in the press for doing that, and they've gotten a whole lot of bad press for having shipped stuff that's got security flaws. And, you know, there's a whole debate that we could go into there. But that number, 63,000, just fascinated me because I wondered what kind of enterprise-class bug tracking system you have to manage 63,000 bugs. At which point it dawned on me that if you have to have that much effort in tracking bugs, maybe you need fewer bugs instead of better bug tracking systems. So going back to what you're saying about failed tests, if you've got that many failed tests, see, you're incurring technical debt. Now, this is a term that all of us have experienced, whether or not we put a label to it. Anytime you're working with code that's fragile, where you know if somebody changes that module, bad things are going to happen. So we don't touch that module unless it's absolutely necessary. And if it is absolutely necessary, we get out the full, fire protection suits because we're going to have to go into the breach to get into this code. That kind of bad, scary code, well, let's not find special ways of managing that pain. Let's fix it, right? So anytime I hear about tests having to stay red, I'll remind you that that's a choice. Now, it may be a choice that you're making with a full perspective on all of the business pressures that you're under, but I'll suggest it's a very expensive choice because that means that you can't trust your test runs. They go red, and the first thing you're going to say to yourself is, oh, that's just the test breaking, or we know about that. Once upon a time on a project, I had a test suite that was kind of like that. I had a bunch of things that were failing for reasons that we didn't care about. This is feedback we didn't care about. And I went through and looked at, we had 75 failures or something, and I looked at the first 38 of them, and they were all for this one reason that we didn't care about. So I didn't look at the remaining ones, and it turns out I missed a horrible bug because I got lulled into thinking that all of my bugs were in that class. So the tests must continue to reveal interesting feedback and information, otherwise you'll lose the value of even the good tests, right? So I'll suggest that if there's really one that you're not going to fix for a couple of weeks, move it into a different test suite with big red flags all over it saying, this is a known bug and we're going to ship with this issue. You asked one, so I'm going to go over here and then I'll... Oh, okay. Yeah?
It's really no broken windows. I mean, it's what you're violating.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
And it becomes a slippery slope because if you stop testing at that point, well, then your code is going to start slipping too because if you test, your design changes when you test, and if you start letting your design slip, ultimately it creates systemic problems. And so I just say overall it's a very bad thing. Don't leave broken windows.
So I'm so glad you said broken windows. So Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point wrote about the broken window phenomenon where they found in, was it New York City, that neighborhoods that had broken windows tended to have worse violence and worse crimes. And they did simple things like erasing graffiti and repairing windows, and the crime rate went down. Just because it appeared that people cared more. So the pragmatic programmers, Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas, wrote about this in their book, The Pragmatic Programmer, as drawing the analogy with the little breakages in code that we kind of say, oh, well, that's okay. We'll deal with that one later, right? Well, it turns out it has the same effect, because then we say that's okay to more things. Stuff that we didn't have to say that's okay to. Yeah?
In follow-up to that, my old company switched from traditional waterfall to a hybrid Scrum XP. And one of the things that we did to get rid of all those red flag bugs and products that were really shoddy, and the good thing about Agile is that you can actually do refactoring within your iteration. And upper management doesn't need to know about that because you refactor it when you're developing. Whereas in the past, and traditionally, you'd say we need X amount of time in order to refactor, which they'll come back and say no.
Yeah, they'll come back and say it works. Why are you going to change it? So refactoring, just in case you don't know the official definition of refactoring is changing the implementation without changing the behavior. Essentially cleaning up. Now, it may seem to some managers believe that this should be unnecessary because if it works, it just works. Don't touch it. But the fact is that by refactoring, you get more maintainable code, so the next change is easier to implement. So you reduce your technical debt when you refactor. Yeah?
I just had a quick question about release cycles. It sounded like on the teams you've been on, it's sort of a longer process. And what if changes are coming out every week or 2 weeks? How does this all work in terms of Agile?
Okay, so the question is, what if changes are coming every week or 2 weeks? How does this work with Agile? Well, that is Agile, that change is happening that frequently. And I'm sorry if I left you with the impression that these were longer stretches of time. For the Agile projects that I've been on, our iterations are typically 2 weeks. So they're very quick turnaround kind of things, and they should be. It should be small incremental changes so you get that continuous stream of value. So it works very well with Agile, which is why I was giving you the puzzled look, because that's exactly why you need Agile. Harry, it is now time. I thank you all so much. Wow, thank you.